Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 37. I am the show's host, Kyle, and for those of you who are listening, thank you so much for tuning in. I do the show because people like it and listen to it. If you are listening to the show and like the show, please share the show with fans, family, friends, whoever may be interested in learning more about foreign policy and keep up with foreign policy news. I think the first story I'm going to touch on today is why, again, this news out there is so important, and that is that the Pentagon, or that the U.S. government, spends an additional $250 billion outside the Pentagon's budget on defense. So we already see all the pie charts and graphs where it says the U.S. spends as much on defense as the next 8 or 10 countries combined, depending on how you look at the measures. Either way, I mean, what the U.S. spends is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, no country even comes close to it. And so if you're thinking about what defense spending is supposed to be for, which is that everybody in America chips in a couple bucks, that way we could guarantee that the Russians or the Chinese or whoever aren't going to bomb America. And then you look at how much all the other countries in the world spend, and you realize that most of the countries in the world that spend a lot on defense are allied with the U.S. anyways, but even if you're looking outside of that to countries like Iran, North Korea, Russia, or China, what they spend on defense doesn't even compare to what we spend on defense. And so as somebody who's interested in this, and even before I was a non-interventionist anti-war type, I always wondered why the U.S. had to spend so much more on defense than all these other countries. I mean, even if all these countries teamed up and were working against the U.S. together, why is it that they could spend a small fraction of what we do and they're able to defend themselves and their countries, but we have to spend a whole lot more, and we still feel insecure apparently, and there are still Americans demanding that we spend more on defense? Especially when you look at countries like China and Russia, where China is far more populated and Russia is far more vast. Well, maybe not far more, but there's more of Russia than the U.S., and there's definitely more of Russia and China in the U.S., and you would think to defend those two countries you have to spend at least a similar amount to what you spent to defend America. And so just on the face of it, I mean, just if you could get people to look at it and ask that critical question, then I think we could start to chip into the defense budget. And even, you know, if it's somebody on the right wing who's like, well, we need to defend the homeland at all costs, then your follow-up question should be, what, we can't defend ourselves as well as the commies in Russia and China can? I mean, what is with that? Part of the reason, we apparently won the Cold War, and part of the reason that America's so great is we're supposed to be able to do things better than everybody else. Well, if you had to spend 5 times what the other countries do on defense, are you doing it better? Absolutely not. If somebody buys, let's say, like a gun for $200, and then somebody goes out and buys that same gun for $1,000, is the person with the $1,000 gun any more protected, or did he do anything better than the guy with the $200 gun? Absolutely not. So this is kind of just a ridiculous thing on the face of it, and hopefully would make Americans call into question the defense budget. I think the reason the defense budget is so high, and especially into comparison to other countries, is that it costs a hell of a lot more to fight counterinsurgencies and offensive wars than it does to defend the country. I mean, I've heard Ron Paul give ideas that, the U.S. could be defended with 14 nuclear submarines or so, and we spend a couple $1 billion each year on defense, and that's that. And when in reality, what we do is we spend a couple $1 billion on things like that, but then we end up spending another $500 billion on overseas wars and 10 aircraft carriers and new F-35 planes, and whenever you have a bureaucracy that's so big, you waste a lot of money, and there's a lot of cronyism, and lobbyists all have to get their piece of every pie. However, none of it would happen if you weren't fighting the overseas wars, because the defense budget would be pretty small, and there's just less to eat out of a small pie. If they're skimming, say, like 10% of the Pentagon budget is going for crony reasons and shouldn't be cost. If your Pentagon budget is $12 billion, well, that's $1.2 billion, which is bad, but not awful. But then if your Pentagon budget is 500 and something billion, then you're losing 50 something $billion. And that's, hard-earned taxpayer money that was, is wealth produced by the country by, some poor guy's blood, sweat, and tears poured into, either some like technological development or building a house or whatever. All this, wealth that's created by the U.S. is simply wasted on all these defense contracts, because we have a 500 and something $1 billion defense budget going to fight all these overseas wars. But it's actually worse than that, because we spend an additional $250 billion a year on defense. So we have the Pentagon budget, which is 500 and something billion, and Trump wants to increase it to $574 billion total. And you would think the Pentagon budget would include things like fighting overseas wars, but that's just not the case. Overseas contingency operations cost the U.S., I believe, expected to cost the U.S. another $64.6 billion next year. And this isn't included in the Pentagon budget. So we have a case here where there's going to be the Pentagon budget of $574 billion and then additional $64 billion that's really hidden from the American people. Because any American with limited time, maybe you got, 2 kids and a job and a whole bunch of other stuff to do and family and friends, and you want to tackle all this and catch your favorite TV show, you don't have a whole lot of time to read the news or look at this stuff. But if, you just listen to this podcast and share this podcast and then, look at what's going on behind the numbers, it's not so clear. Because that person reads it and says, oh, we spent $500 and something billion on defense. That seems kind of high, but, shrug. But then there's another $64 billion that's actually going to find the overseas wars that I'm sure every American assumes is included in the Pentagon budget. But wait, it gets worse than that. Because we have another $9.5 billion, nearly $10 billion going to FBI and cybersecurity activities within the Department of Justice. Now, this is, money that goes to defend the United States. The FBI looks to defend, the country on the homeland front from terrorists, cybersecurity, obviously. I mean, truly, this is all defense spending, right? Because it's money spent to defend the country from foreign attackers. And this isn't this isn't included in the Pentagon budget, and it doesn't go up on the numbers include in defense spending. We have $13.9 billion being spent on the National Nuclear Security Administration. I believe this is the administration that cares for, secures, and maintains the nuclear weapons. The State Department spends $27.1 billion. There may be some questions on why the State Department would be included in defense spending, but the idea, the goal of the State Department is really to negotiate with other countries, right? All these countries have State Departments, and all the State Departments talk to each other. That way they don't get into war. So really this is defense spending, right? A lot of these ambassadors and State Department officials reside in other countries, and so, we have them over there. Of course, the State Department has to pay for security forces to defend a lot of these people, so that is a little bit more clearly defense spending. Some of this money is going in foreign aid to other countries or to the United Nations. I think most Americans would argue that if we left the United Nations or decreased our funding to the United Nations, it weakens the United States' ability to defend itself because we're not involved in that organization or whatever. So I think this really should go towards defense spending, and it's hidden away by putting it under the State Department. We have the Homeland Security Department spending $44.1 billion a year. I don't think I have to argue too much to prove that that's defense spending. I mean, the organization was set up to defend the homeland from terrorists and other overseas organizations, so this is obviously defense spending and it should go under the Pentagon budget, but once again, hidden away from the American people. We have the Department of Veteran Affairs spending $78.9 billion every year. This one, I guess I would not be surprised if somebody wanted to debate me and say, this really isn't defense spending, but it is, because it is the repercussions of our overseas wars. Obviously, we wouldn't be spending nearly as much on veteran affairs if we didn't have so many disabled veterans and so many veterans who have either lost their lives or were injured in some way, either mentally or physically, in overseas wars. You also have just the sheer number of troops you need. If you take the Ron Paul plan and only have a couple subs rolling around, then you only need a couple thousand people in your military, which drastically cuts into the, veteran affairs budget because there's not very many veterans, and so they take up pretty few resources from the federal government. But because you have such a massive military that's constantly fighting overseas wars and constantly putting our troops in harm's way, that leads them to getting injured and everything like that, you have to spend a lot of money on the Veteran Affairs Administration. And so once again, I wouldn't be surprised if most Americans thought that this would be a part of the Pentagon budget. I would assume that should be, because the Pentagon's the employee, and then the Pentagon, cares for them after they leave their service to the country. So I guess, it's just something that's completely looked over, completely missed. Nobody likes talking about it. But the fact is that the U.S. spends way more than $574 billion a year on defense. It's actually much, much closer to just over $800 billion a year. I mean, we're really getting to that point where the $1 trillion mark is not far away, and another major overseas intervention will probably put the U.S. At that number. Because another overseas operation war that would cost American, military men their lives and get them injured would definitely raise the amount we spend on veteran affairs. It would add to the overseas contingency funds that we spend right now, $64-something billion a year on. It would add to the amount we have to spend at the Pentagon on weapons and things like that. So all this adds up, and another intervention, we're spending $1 trillion a year on what the government labels defense spending. Now, I think this is another pretty sneaky thing they do themselves, right? Because even all these graphs, even the ones the libertarians bring up and all the anti-war folk, always label it defense spending, and it's really not defense spending. This is the cost of the empire. It's going to cost the American people $1 trillion a year. So that's $1 trillion of output. Now, if you think of yourself and all of your neighbors and how much output you generate a year, your small community, not small, your fairly large city will probably output like $1 trillion of wealth a year. And you have to think that all of that is being spent on the Pentagon. All of that wealth is being completely wasted on what we call defense spending, but it's really maintaining the empire. And so you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Do we want to have this empire when it's going to cost us so much of our time, money, and wealth? If the government made it real simple and said, you have to work for the government, I don't know, let's say 2 months out of the year. You have to work for the government 2 months every year so we can maintain our overseas empire, so we could kill Iraqis and Syrians and Yemeni and Somalians and Libyans. You have to work for free, really hard, backbreaking labor for 2 months a year. And I don't think very many Americans would sign up for that. And that's why, the Federal Reserve is so important, because it allows these wars to be funded through the hidden tax of inflation. But the government has been able to propagandize, hide, and then, justify the spending of billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on an empire. And it's really disgusting. It's so wasteful. And there's so many Americans that could live so much better lives if we stop wasting this money. All right. Now we're going to move into the French election. We have Macron beating Le Pen in the French election. Like, on a personal level, I don't know very much about either of these two. Le Pen was labeled as a Nazi and kind of made out to be a Trumpian. I don't know how true that was. It seemed to me that she was a little bit more of a moderate than Trump, and actually a little bit more principled than Trump. She came out and condemned Trump's airstrikes in Syria, which I was happy to see, just because, those weren't what Trump ran on. That's not putting America first. France is involved in, I think, a sneaky amount of overseas interventionism, especially in North Africa right now. Algeria and Mali both have a lot of Islamist activities, mostly because of the U.S. war in Libya that France really pushed for. And I think it's significant that we do have Macron winning, just because he is much more of a interventionist than Le Pen was. And at least from the perspective of a non-interventionist, I think it was probably a loss, although Le Pen was certainly not friendly towards Muslim people and had absolutely no concept or of blowback or why people from these Middle Eastern countries may be upset with the West, and just kind of, made it out to be an East-West, or not an East-West thing, Islam-Christian thing rather than a empire thing. And that's exactly what it is. It's because of the empire. It's all because of the empires. Moving on to Israel news, we have an Israeli bill that was introduced to the Israeli parliament by the Likud party, which is the party of the leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. The bill looks to make Israel a more official Jewish state. There's a lot of concern that this bill will turn the Palestinians into a more official version of second-class citizens, although I think the Palestinians are already probably third-class citizens in Israel, and we are really moving close to an apartheid state in that country, if we're not already there. If you look at the situation in Gaza, where they're blockaded in, they're barricaded in, they really can't get out, they're kind of starving to death in an open-air prison there. They can't even import concrete, so they're making houses out of, like, recycled bottles and all this ridiculous stuff that these poor people have to suffer through just to get by every day. I mean, like, if you're constructing houses out of a plastic bottle, are you really that much of a threat to your neighboring government, especially when that neighboring government is backed pretty much entirely by the U.S. government? I mean, let's be realistic here. And so this state that already treats the Palestinians so poorly is now going to be an official Jewish state, which the Palestinians are almost all Muslims or Christians. There are quite a few Christian Palestinians, and so these people are just going to be treated very, very poorly, and a little bit more legally so now. We also have Israel withholding $1 million in funding from the UN because a UN organization voted that Israel's claim to Jerusalem was null and void. I think this just goes to show kind of the pettiness of the Israeli government, that they're willing to pull funding from the UN, an organization that really defends them in their actions overseas. I shouldn't say overseas. I guess across borders would be more important. Of course, Israel still occupies the Golan Heights, and I think the UN is really helping that to happen. I think there's UN peacekeepers in that area as well, and so Israel is able to do this with the cover of the UN. The UN really covers the Israeli treatment of the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, and doesn't really cast Israel in the same light that cast other countries, and who do treat their civilians poorly, like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. All these countries certainly treat their civilians poorly, but no worse than the Israelis treat the people of Gaza. And so you have to wonder why the UN won't condemn Israel's actions there, but they'll condemn the actions of other countries. Moving into Africa, we have 5 African countries, West African countries, including Mali, forming a coalition to be anti the Islamist groups. These would be groups, I'm guessing, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in West Africa. I'm not sure if Boko Haram has spread that far west yet, but that's also a group that I would guess that probably some Islamists would pick up the name just for fundraising purposes. This is really a consequence of the U.S. war in Libya. Essentially what the U.S. did there is they went in, they overthrew Gaddafi, completely destabilized the whole country, made it really a lawless breeding ground for the Islamists to be able to recruit, raise funds. I'm sure they're selling slaves to raise their funds. I'm sure they're part of the people that are raping the women, taking advantage of migrants by putting them on, taking their money, putting them on boats, and then letting the boats capsize. Some of these smugglers will take money from a family, put the kid on a boat and say, if you don't give us more money, then we're going to keep your kid or sink the boat or whatever. And so they really blackmail the families into taking even more money. And so this is the Libya that the United States, particularly Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and Samantha Power created for the people of Libya and West Africa. And now this violence has spilled over into neighboring countries like Mali, Tunisia, Algeria is over there, and it's a pretty nasty situation. In Nigeria, we have the government there making a deal with Boko Haram, where if everybody can remember back to the April of 2014, I believe, when Boko Haram took 200 and some odd, mostly Christian young girls hostage, and we had the First Lady tweeting out, save our children or something like that. And the U.S. was kind of moving towards more interventionism in Africa. And I think that Save Our Girls campaign was probably trying to make that more public, but there was some public backlash against it. I don't think the Republicans really liked it and stood up for something for once, although it probably wasn't for the right reasons. It was just to be against the Obamas. However, they did stand up to an intervention, and so the U.S. actions in Africa have probably remained more covert than they needed to be. So we had this exchange for 82 of those girls being exchanged for 5 Boko Haram fighters. The article I read made the point, I think this is an important point and a good point, that trading the 5 Boko Haram, and these are apparently Boko Haram leadership people, back into the line of fighting really wasn't that big of a deal, because so many of these groups are so decentralized, and it's just people being really pissed off, and this is the only way they could kind of earn a living and fight for what they're looking for. Take up this ideology, and it's not very centralized, and so transferring leadership back into the region really doesn't make that much of a difference, because it's just one more fighter, and there seems to be an unlimited number of terrorist fighters in that region, because the more you kill, the more you create, that I've talked about so many times in the past. And so that was an interesting position the article brought up. It also was talking about what actually is happening with these girls, and it doesn't sound like they're going home. Apparently, previously, a deal was worked out between Boko Haram and the Nigerian government, and 20-something girls were released, but those girls haven't been returned to their families yet. They remain in the Nigerian capital, I guess, receiving treatment and things like that. I don't know, maybe treatment's not available in the village they're from. However, it seems like being around family would be something that would be helpful for people who experience a traumatic event. So just an interesting footnote that even though these girls were freed from the prisoners of the captivity of Boko Haram, doesn't mean they've necessarily escaped captivity completely yet, because it seems like the Nigerian government is at least going to use them for some propaganda, kind of being propaganda hostages now. On Friday's show, I talked about the service member killed in Somalia, just to update that story a little bit more, because I didn't have very many details when it happened. The fighting occurred, I think, somewhere near Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, some 40 miles away. One service member was killed and 2 more were injured. According to reports, they killed the Al-Shabaab targets they were fighting against. Again, they always claim that it's a big deal when we kill Al-Shabaab leadership. I don't know if they just classify every Al-Shabaab fighter as a leader, or they really are killing off the leadership of these organizations, and it really just doesn't matter because they're strapping suicide vests to themselves and walking into a market and blowing themselves up. It's not a very complicated fighting strategy. And so that was reported. I'm not sure that those people were killed in the fighting, because I did see reports that later there was an attack near the site where that skirmish happened between the U.S. service members and Boko Haram. And reports say that the helicopters blew an awful lot of stuff up around there, so maybe the U.S. kind of went back later and cleaned it up to make it look good, to say this man died fighting against against Al-Shabaab, not Boko Haram. It's hard to keep all of your jihadist groups straight sometimes. In Afghanistan, we have border fighting between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think the border there is kind of a made-up border to begin with. I'm not sure. I don't know if Pakistan is actually one giant country of Pakistan, or it would be a bunch of much smaller countries. I think Afghanistan would probably not be a very strongly centralized country if it wasn't for the U.S., and so it's kind of interesting that countries that really aren't one cohesive country are fighting each other over a border. So far, at least 50 Afghani troops have been killed. I saw reports that another 18 people have been killed, but most of them were civilians. And so, as always, no matter how many troops die, it always seems like there's an awful lot of civilians killed in the crossfire. Another interesting point of this is just the Afghani military. I mean, they're really getting beat up. The armed forces in Afghanistan are getting killed by ISIS and the Taliban in the country, and so any type of border war, border skirmishes with Afghanistan or with Pakistan just take away the ability of the Afghani military to fight against the terrorists, and that certainly must add to the frustration that Afghani military trying to rid the country of the Taliban and ISIS. Moving to Iraq, we have an attack against the Kurds in Kirkuk by ISIS. The attack was repelled by U.S. air power, but 2 Peshmerga fighters, which is Iraqi Kurdish people, was killed in the attack. One reason I bring up this story is just because I'm seeing a lot of this kind of attack by ISIS where they're going in and attacking checkpoints in random cities. It seems like they're moving more towards the guerrilla war fighting tactics and less away from the caliphate, fighting for the caliphate tactics. It seems pretty obvious that at this point the caliphate will be destroyed sooner, if not later. Raqqa will fall, Deir Zor will fall, Mosul will fall, Tel Afar will eventually fall. Even if these countries are bombed into rubble, they will be taken by the U.S. bad forces or the Russian bad forces. So at some point, ISIS will no longer hold territory, but that doesn't mean the terrorist group won't exist anymore. I think this is kind of a false bill of goods that's been sold to a lot of American people, that all we need to do is defeat ISIS by kicking them out of Mosul. That's just going to make them terrorists. With the way the U.S. is more forwarding, deploying their troops in Iraq and Syria, I think a concern would be is that U.S. troops may become a target of the ISIS fighters. Maybe they'll go to checkpoints where U.S. soldiers are, and we could start seeing more U.S. soldiers die in these countries. We've already seen, I think, more troops die under Trump than in the last year of Obama. There seems to be a lot of death. We had the one in Yemen, we had a couple in Afghanistan, a couple in Mosul now, at least 1 or 2 in Syria, 1 in Somalia. So it does seem like the U.S. must be deploying their troops in a different method because we're seeing more U.S. troops die. We have an airstrike carried out by the Iraqi military, or some kind of mortar fire, maybe artillery fire by the Iraqi military that hit a school and killed at least 68 people, mostly women and children. A story coming out of Syria says that the YPG has advanced U.S. weapons. This includes high-tech night vision goggles and advanced optic sights for their weapons. One concern about this is just where are they getting these weapons from? There's only certain countries that are able to buy those weapons from the United States. One speculation was maybe they're funneling from Ukraine into the hands of the YPG, maybe as an anti-Russia thing, although the YPG isn't necessarily anti-Russia anyways. And so this could create a relationship problem between the U.S. and Turkey, especially if the U.S. is giving these weapons to Turkey, because it will make the YPG fighters more effective against Turkish fighters. Whenever ISIS is eventually defeated, there's going to be a clash between the Syrian Kurds and Turkey. And the more the U.S. has backed and weaponized and armed the Syrian Kurds, it's going to create a problem for when they're using those weapons to kill Turkey, who's a NATO ally of the U.S. So that's coming. Good news coming out of Syria. U.S. and Russia have reestablished their communication line. This is to prevent accidents and to let each other know what each other is doing in the country. Obviously, this is a great thing because we don't want hot war breaking out between the U.S. and Russia over some dumb incident in Syria. Fighting has reduced since the establishment of the safe zones. I actually saw Will Porter reporting on this today, so that's good to see that safe zone idea is working. I think it's going to work a lot better because there's nobody that's really... It was set up in a way that only the Syrian government and the Russians will really stop bombing these areas. And the Syrian government and the Russians were a part of the planning the safe zones, so they were only willing to plant them in areas that they were willing not to bomb. We're not going to see any situation where there's countries destroying each other's anti-aircraft weaponry or, destroying each other's air power and stuff like that. Although the U.S. has been back and forth on if they're going to respect the safe zones, I did read, and this is very fortunate, that the U.S. wasn't bombing in any of the safe zones anyways, and they just don't operate in these areas, so good to see, right? It avoids the problem of, possibly the U.S. violating these safe zones. However, the U.S. hasn't come out and directly said that they will respect the safe zones, and that's disconcerting just in case the battlefield were ever to shift and the U.S. would be bombing in other places. Last, I just want to update Venezuela, which is getting kind of messy. We have 38 people dead in protests over the past 5 weeks. I saw a video online of an armored vehicle that's kind of a riot control vehicle running over protesters. That country obviously developed a very unfortunate and problemsome form of government. I don't want to get into too much of just the ideological stuff there, but I think the concern for the U.S. is that the U.S. likes to get involved in these sorts of issues, and so we could unnecessarily create hostilities with a South American country because we want to put sanctions on the government of Venezuela or on people of Venezuela. I don't know, just to show that we can. It doesn't make sense as to why we do it, but it's something that may happen, so I think it should be on all of our radars. Typically what's going to happen is you're going to have somebody go on the news and say, man, I saw this really terrible thing about what's happening in Venezuela, and the U.S. government isn't doing anything about it. Why aren't we stopping this? Trump needs to stop it. And so Trump's going to say, oh man, this is going on. I need to stop it. And he's going to put sanctions on Venezuela. And it's not going to hurt a single person who the sanctions are put on because they're all rich people connected to the government. It will lead to more starvation of a population that's already starving. And so these are just the consequences of American foreign policy, and hopefully we could affect some change. Get out there, share the podcast, demand that people call their politicians and say, hey, we want less defense spending, we want less over intervention overseas, we want to protect our troops by bringing our troops home and not having them on the front lines in places like Iraq and Syria. We don't want sanctions on Venezuela, and we want decent relations with Russia. So if we could make those demands and get those demands met, I think America would be a whole lot better, and the people here would be a whole lot happier and wealthier. So something to think about. If you are listening to the show, share the show, friends, family, whoever might listen to it. Follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE. The website for the podcast is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. My website is kylesfilesblog.com. I do a news roundup every day that also gets published at libertarianinstitute.org. I should have a new article up at libertarianinstitute.org pretty soon, so I will definitely share that on the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. If you're interested in having conversations about foreign policy related stuff, request to join the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. Other than that, I do email out my news roundups every day, so if you want to sign up for that email list, it's at kylesfilesblog.com, and then on the right side of the page there, you can subscribe to the email list, and I'll email you all the good news you need every morning. In the past week, for some reason, I messed up and didn't send the news roundup, so they should be coming out. You should have gotten one this morning. Let me know if you did, if you are signed up for the email list. Thanks, everybody. See you Wednesday.